The year was 1903, and the Lower East Side of Manhattan pulsed with the rhythm of immigrant dreams and daily survival. Among the tenement buildings that stretched like weathered fingers toward the smoky sky, Patrick O'Shea carried burdens that seemed heavier than the cargo he loaded at the docks each morning. His calloused hands, stained permanently with salt and rope burns, trembled not from the cold autumn air but from exhaustion that ran deeper than bone. 2 years had passed since consumption claimed his beloved wife, Mary, leaving him alone with 2 children who had grown quieter with each passing month. Molly, his 12-year-old daughter, moved through their cramped apartment like a ghost, her once bright eyes now holding shadows too mature for her age. She had taken on responsibilities that should have belonged to a grown woman, mending clothes by candlelight and rationing their meager food supplies with mathematical precision that broke Patrick's heart. Timothy, barely 8 years old, had retreated so far into himself that days would pass without him speaking more than necessary words. The boy who once filled their home with laughter and endless questions now sat in corners, whittling small pieces of wood into shapes only he understood. Patrick would find these tiny wooden figures scattered throughout the apartment. Animals, people, boats, silent testimonies to thoughts his son could no longer voice. The port work was grueling, starting before dawn and ending when his back screamed for mercy. Patrick's shoulders bore the permanent curve of a man who had spent years bent under the weight of others' cargo, loading ships that would carry goods to places he would never see. The pay was barely enough to keep them fed and housed in their 2-room tenement on Orchard Street, where the walls were thin enough to hear every argument, every cry, every prayer whispered in a dozen different languages. He had tried to manage alone, believing that a father's love could somehow fill the gaping hole Mary's death had torn in their family's fabric. But Molly's hollow cheeks and Timothy's increasing silence told him otherwise. The boy had started wetting the bed again, something that hadn't happened since he was 4. Molly would clean the sheets without complaint, hanging them to dry in their tiny kitchen where they blocked what little light came through the single grimy window. Patrick's own mother had died when he was Timothy's age, leaving him with only fragmented memories of warm bread and gentle hands. He had no template for this kind of loss, no wisdom passed down through generations about how to be both father and mother to children who needed more than his rough affection and stumbling attempts at comfort. The neighbors tried to help in their own ways. Mrs. Kowalski from downstairs would sometimes send up a pot of soup, and old Mr. Chun, who ran the small grocery on the corner, would slip extra apples into Patrick's purchases without charging for them. But these gestures, kind as they were, only emphasized how alone they truly were in their grief. Sleep had become Patrick's enemy. He would lie awake listening to his children's restless breathing, wondering if he was failing them in ways he couldn't even recognize. The weight of their dependence on him felt crushing some nights, when the reality of their situation would settle over him like fog rolling in from the harbor. He was one accident, one injury, one missed day of work away from losing everything. The apartment itself seemed to mourn with them. Mary's presence lingered in every corner, the way she had arranged the few pieces of furniture to maximize their small space. The herbs she had grown in coffee cans on the windowsill, now brown and brittle, the faded curtains she had sewn from fabric scraps begged from the textile factory where she had worked before the children were born. Patrick knew something had to change when he came home one evening to find Molly collapsed over her sewing, having fainted from hunger because she had given her portion of dinner to Timothy. The sight of his daughter's pale face and the way Timothy had curled up beside her, trying to share his own meager body warmth, finally broke through Patrick's stubborn pride. Part 2. The Woman Who Asks No Questions, 3,500 characters. The women's shelter on Hester Street operated from the basement of a synagogue, its entrance marked only by a small wooden sign in Hebrew and English. Patrick had never imagined himself walking through those doors, his work boots echoing against stone steps worn smooth by countless desperate souls seeking refuge. The smell of challah bread mixed with the scent of unwashed bodies and carbolic soap, creating an atmosphere that spoke of survival rather than comfort. Sister Rebecca, a stern Jewish woman with intelligent eyes and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, listened to Patrick's halting explanation without judgment. Her office was cramped but organized, filled with ledgers documenting the stories of women who had nowhere else to turn. When Patrick finished speaking, his voice barely above a whisper as he described Molly's fainting spell. Sister Rebecca nodded once and consulted a thick notebook. "I have someone," she said simply. "Her name is Sarah. She came to us 3 months ago from Pennsylvania. She doesn't speak much about her past, but her hands know work, and her heart knows children's needs. She's been helping in our kitchen, and I've watched her with the young ones who come through here. They trust her instinctively." Patrick waited outside the shelter for nearly an hour before Sarah emerged. She was smaller than he had expected, her dark hair pulled back under a worn black hat that cast shadows across her face. Her dress was clean but patched in several places, and she carried a single battered suitcase that seemed to contain everything she owned. When she looked up at him, Patrick saw eyes that held depths of sadness he recognized from his own mirror. The trolley ride to Avenue C passed in almost complete silence. Sarah sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the city pass through the grimy windows with an expression that suggested she was cataloging escape routes rather than admiring the scenery. Patrick tried twice to make conversation, asking about her experience with children and her preferences for household arrangements, but her responses were brief nods or single-word answers that discouraged further attempts. When they reached the tenement building, Sarah's eyes swept the street with practiced efficiency, taking in the fire escapes, the positioning of doorways, the flow of foot traffic. Patrick recognized this behavior from his own early days in America, when every new place required assessment for both opportunity and danger. He wondered what had taught her such caution, but something in her posture warned against asking. Climbing the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, Patrick was acutely aware of how the building must appear to her. The hallways smelled of cooking cabbage and human bodies pressed too close together. Paint peeled from walls like diseased skin, and the gas fixtures flickered with unreliable light. Children's voices echoed from behind thin doors, mixing with adult arguments in languages that created a constant background symphony of urban struggle. Sarah's first glimpse of their home came when Patrick fumbled with the key, his hands shaking slightly from nervousness he hadn't expected to feel. The door opened to reveal their small kitchen, where Molly sat at the wooden table attempting to teach Timothy his letters. Both children looked up with expressions that mixed curiosity with wariness, their faces pale in the afternoon light that filtered through the single window. "Children," Patrick said, his voice unusually formal. "This is Sarah. She's going to help us for a while." Sarah set down her suitcase and removed her hat, revealing hair that was prematurely streaked with gray at the temples. She studied Molly and Timothy with the same careful attention she had given the street, but when her gaze met theirs, something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. Without speaking, Sarah moved to the small stove and examined its condition, testing the gas flow and checking the cleanliness of the few pots and pans Patrick owned. She opened the cupboards, taking inventory of their sparse supplies with the methodical approach of someone accustomed to making much from little. Her movements were economical and purposeful, wasting no motion or time. Within an hour, Sarah had transformed the kitchen. She had found ingredients Patrick hadn't realized they possessed, and combined them into a soup that filled the apartment with aromas that spoke of comfort and care. She mended a tear in Timothy's shirt while the soup simmered, her needle moving with the precision of someone who had spent years making repairs that needed to last. She showed Molly how to properly knead bread dough, her hands guiding the girl's smaller ones with gentle pressure that communicated technique without words. That first evening, as they sat around the table sharing a meal that tasted better than any Patrick could remember, he watched Sarah interact with his children. She didn't try to fill Mary's place with forced cheerfulness or overwhelming affection. Instead, she created a different kind of presence, one that was steady and reliable without demanding emotional response. Timothy, who hadn't spoken voluntarily in weeks, asked her to pass the bread. Molly smiled for the first time in months when Sarah complimented her efforts with the needle and thread. Patrick found himself studying Sarah's profile as she ate, wondering about the experiences that had taught her to move through the world with such careful control. Her hands bore the marks of hard labor, but they were gentle when they touched his children. Her eyes missed nothing, constantly scanning their surroundings with alertness that spoke of someone who had learned that safety was never guaranteed. That night, after Sarah had settled into the small alcove off the kitchen that would serve as her room. Patrick lay awake listening to the building settle around them. For the first time in 2 years, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. His children had eaten a full meal and gone to bed without the restless anxiety that had plagued their nights since Mary's death. The apartment felt different somehow, as if Sarah's presence had shifted the very air they breathed. He didn't yet know what demons Sarah carried with her, or what circumstances had driven her to seek refuge in a shelter, but he recognized in her the same fierce protectiveness he felt for his own children, and that recognition created the first fragile foundation of trust between them. Part 3. The word that freezes time, 3,500 characters. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival, and the O'Shea household had settled into rhythms that felt almost natural. Sarah rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, her movements in the kitchen so quiet that Patrick often woke to the smell of fresh bread without having heard her working. She had established routines that gave structure to their days. Laundry on Mondays, thorough cleaning on Wednesdays, mending and repairs on Fridays. The children responded to this predictability with visible relief, their constant anxiety slowly giving way to something approaching peace. Timothy had begun speaking more, though still sparingly, and his nightly terrors had decreased from every night to perhaps twice a week. Molly had started eating full portions again, no longer feeling the need to sacrifice her own nourishment for her brother's welfare. Patrick found himself arriving home each evening with anticipation rather than dread, knowing he would find his children fed, clean, and engaged in activities appropriate for their ages rather than struggling with adult responsibilities. Sarah maintained her quiet presence, speaking only when necessary but communicating volumes through her actions. She had learned each family member's preferences without asking. Timothy liked his eggs slightly runny, Molly preferred her hair braided tightly to keep it from her face while she worked, Patrick needed strong coffee to face the physical demands of his job. These small attentions created an atmosphere of care that had been missing since Mary's death. The basement of their tenement building served multiple purposes for the residents. It housed the building's coal supply, provided storage space for those lucky enough to have possessions worth storing, and offered a refuge for children when the weather made street play impossible. Timothy had discovered that the basement's dim corners were perfect for his whittling, and he often spent afternoon hours there with his small knife and pieces of scrap wood, creating his mysterious figurines in solitude. On this particular day, Timothy had been working on a carving that was more ambitious than his usual efforts, a figure of a woman holding a child. The detail work required him to balance the piece on a wooden crate while he used both hands to guide his knife. The crate, weakened by years of moisture and weight, chose that moment to collapse, sending Timothy tumbling backward into a pile of coal dust and sharp-edged debris. The boy's cry of pain echoed through the basement and up the wooden stairs, carrying clearly to the kitchen where Sarah was preparing vegetables for dinner. Without hesitation, she abandoned her work and rushed toward the sound, her footsteps quick but controlled on the narrow staircase. She found Timothy on his back, tears streaming down his face, one leg twisted at an angle that suggested injury, blood seeping through his torn trousers. Sarah's response was immediate and instinctive. She knelt beside the boy, her hands moving gently but efficiently to assess his injuries. The cut on his leg was deep but not dangerous, and his ankle was sprained rather than broken. She spoke to him in soothing tones as she worked, her voice carrying maternal warmth that she had kept carefully controlled until this moment of crisis. "It's all right, sweetheart," she murmured, tearing strips from her own petticoat to create bandages. "You're going to be fine. Let me take care of this for you." Timothy, overwhelmed by pain and the sudden rush of genuine maternal care, looked up at Sarah's face bent over him with such concentrated concern. In that moment, instinct overcame the careful emotional barriers he had constructed since his mother's death. The word escaped his lips before conscious thought could stop it. "Mama!" he cried, reaching up to touch Sarah's cheek with his small, dirty hand. The single word seemed to echo in the basement's confined space, hanging in the air between them like a physical presence. Sarah's hands stilled their gentle ministrations, her face draining of color as the implications of Timothy's unconscious plea settled over her. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she seemed unable to move or speak. It was at that precise moment that Patrick appeared at the top of the basement stairs, having heard the commotion from the street as he returned from work. He had taken the steps 2 at a time, his heart racing with the familiar panic that had haunted him since Mary's death, the constant fear that disaster would claim another member of his small family. But as he reached the bottom of the stairs and took in the scene before him, his own body seemed to freeze. There was Sarah, kneeling in the cold dust and debris, her arms around his son, both of them caught in a moment of intimacy that spoke to needs neither had acknowledged aloud. Timothy's face was pressed against Sarah's shoulder, his small body seeking comfort from someone who had responded to his cry with the instinctive care of a mother. And Sarah, despite her obvious emotional distress, was holding the boy with protective tenderness that revealed depths of maternal feeling she had kept carefully hidden. Patrick stood motionless in the doorway, his own heart hammering against his ribs as he processed what he had witnessed. It wasn't simply that Timothy had called Sarah Mama, though that word carved through Patrick's chest like a blade. It was the way Sarah had responded, the way her entire body had curved around his son's small form, the way her face had transformed from careful control to raw, unguarded love. The silence stretched between the three of them, broken only by Timothy's gradually quieting sobs and the distant sounds of the building's other inhabitants continuing their daily lives above them. Sarah slowly lifted her eyes to meet Patrick's gaze, and in her expression he saw not guilt or embarrassment, but a pain so profound it made him step backward involuntarily. Without speaking, Sarah gently helped Timothy to his feet, supporting his weight as they climbed the stairs to the apartment above. Patrick followed in silence, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. As they reached their kitchen, Sarah guided Timothy to a chair and continued tending to his injuries with professional efficiency. But the easy comfort that had characterized their domestic routine had been shattered by a single word. That evening, after Timothy had been fed and put to bed with his leg properly bandaged and elevated, Sarah disappeared into her small alcove without her usual quiet goodnights. Patrick could hear her moving restlessly behind the thin curtain that provided her only privacy, but he didn't dare intrude. Molly, sensing the tension that had settled over their home like a storm cloud, helped clear the dinner dishes without being asked and went to bed early. Patrick sat alone at the kitchen table long into the night, staring at the place where Sarah usually sat, wondering what memories Timothy's innocent word had awakened in her. He found himself thinking about the careful walls she had built around herself, and how his son's cry had cracked them open to reveal the grieving mother hidden underneath. The realization that Sarah might be carrying her own devastating loss created a new understanding between them, one that was built on shared pain rather than simple domestic convenience. The word mama continued to echo in Patrick's mind as the hours passed, and he began to understand that their arrangement had become something far more complicated than he had intended when he first walked through the doors of the women's shelter. Part 4. The Past in a Letter, 3,500 characters. The following days passed in careful politeness that felt more strained than their initial silence had been. Sarah continued her duties with the same efficiency as before, but the easy warmth that had begun to develop between them had been replaced by a watchful distance. She avoided eye contact with Patrick, and when Timothy reached for her hand or sought her attention, she responded with kindness but maintained a deliberate emotional barrier that hadn't existed before his accident. Patrick found himself studying Sarah more closely, noticing details he had previously overlooked. The way her hands sometimes trembled when she folded small clothes that might have belonged to a child Timothy's age. How she would pause in her work when she heard children playing in the street below, her face taking on an expression of longing so profound it made his chest ache. The careful way she arranged Timothy's carved figures on the windowsill, handling each one as if it were precious rather than simply cleaning around them. Timothy seemed confused by the subtle change in Sarah's behavior, occasionally reaching for the maternal comfort she had offered so naturally in the basement, only to encounter gentle but firm boundaries that left him uncertain. Molly, with the perceptiveness of a girl forced to grow up too quickly, began watching Sarah with questions in her eyes that she was too polite to voice. On Thursday morning, Patrick was searching through Sarah's sewing basket for strong thread to repair a torn strap on his work bag. Sarah had gone to the market, and the children were at school, leaving him alone in the apartment for the first time since her arrival. The basket sat on the small table by the window, its contents neatly organized with the same methodical care Sarah brought to every aspect of their home. As he lifted out a spool of black thread, his fingers brushed against something that crinkled like paper. Wedged between the fabric scissors and a packet of needles was a folded letter, its edges worn soft from repeated handling. Patrick's first instinct was to replace it immediately, but as he moved to do so, his eye caught sight of his own name written in unfamiliar handwriting on the exposed portion of the paper. The ethical battle lasted only seconds before curiosity overcame propriety. Patrick unfolded the letter carefully, his heart already racing with the sense that whatever it contained would change everything he thought he knew about the quiet woman who had brought such stability to his home. The paper was cheap, the kind sold at general stores in small towns, and the handwriting was that of someone with limited education but clear determination to communicate urgent information. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Sarah's arrival at the women's shelter, and it bore the heading of a small town in Pennsylvania that Patrick recognized as a mining community. "Sarah," the letter began, "I pray this reaches you before he finds you. Ezra McKinney came through town asking questions about a woman traveling alone with a little girl. He had your description exact, down to the scar on your left wrist from when you burned yourself on the stove. He's not given up looking, and he's got help now. Men with badges who don't ask too many questions about what kind of husband a man was before his wife disappeared." Patrick's hands began to shake as he continued reading. The letter painted a picture of a woman fleeing from dangers he could barely comprehend, dangers that made his own struggles seem simple by comparison. "Jake's alive, Sarah, and he's telling everyone who'll listen that you kidnapped your own daughter and disappeared with money that belonged to him. He's got papers now, legal papers that make him look like the wronged party. That marshal who came through last month, the one with the cold eyes, he believed every word Jake told him. They've got warrants out for you in 3 counties now." The letter went on to describe how Sarah's daughter, a little girl named Hazel, had been taken from the boarding house where Sarah had left her while working in the mines. The child had simply vanished one day while Sarah was underground, and when Sarah emerged from her shift, she found only an empty room and a note claiming that the girl had been returned to her rightful father. Mrs. Patterson saw them load her into a wagon, saw how she cried and reached for you even though you weren't there. Jake had men with him, Sarah. Men who looked like they'd done this kind of thing before. And he's got documents now that say you're an unfit mother, that you abandoned your child to work in conditions no decent woman would accept. Patrick had to stop reading for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of Sarah's loss and the courage it must have taken for her to continue functioning after such devastation. He looked around their small apartment, seeing it now through different eyes, understanding why Sarah had accepted their arrangement so readily and why she maintained such careful emotional distance despite her obvious affection for his children. The letter's final paragraphs contained warnings that made Patrick's blood run cold. Jake had apparently spent months building a case against Sarah, portraying himself as a devoted father whose wife had stolen their child and disappeared without explanation. He had allies now, men with authority who could make legal troubles for anyone who helped her. "Don't come back, Sarah. Don't try to find her on your own. Jake's got friends in places that matter, and they're watching for you. That little girl you love so much, they're using her as bait to draw you out. Stay hidden. Stay safe. Wait for time to change things in your favor. I'm doing what I can to learn where they took her, but you can't help her if you're dead or locked up in some prison where Jake's influence reaches." The letter was signed by someone named Martha Conley, with a postscript that nearly brought tears to Patrick's eyes. "I see Hazel sometimes, Sarah. She asks about her mama every day. She hasn't forgotten you, and she never will. That love you gave her, it's still burning bright inside her, keeping her strong until you can come back for her." Patrick folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the sewing basket, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had learned. Sarah wasn't simply a woman seeking work and shelter. She was a mother in exile, separated from her child by forces that seemed impossibly powerful and corrupt. Her careful emotional barriers weren't signs of coldness or indifference, but protective measures born from devastating loss and legitimate fear. When Sarah returned from the market an hour later, her arms full of vegetables and her face composed in its usual mask of polite distance, Patrick found himself unable to meet her eyes. He understood now why Timothy's innocent cry had affected her so profoundly, and why she had withdrawn from the maternal role that came so naturally to her. Every moment of tenderness with his children must have been both a gift and a reminder of what she had lost. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing their meal in the careful politeness that had replaced their earlier comfort, Patrick watched Sarah interact with Molly and Timothy and saw her differently. Her gentle corrections of Timothy's table manners, her quiet praise for Molly's help with the cooking, her careful attention to their needs, all of it was filtered through the knowledge that she was practicing love on his children while grieving the absence of her own. The weight of Sarah's secret settled over Patrick like a heavy coat, and he realized that their quiet domestic arrangement had become something far more complex than either of them had intended. They weren't simply a widower and a displaced woman helping each other survive. They were two parents, each mourning losses that had reshaped their understanding of what family could mean. Part 5. The attempt to flee, 3,500 characters. Patrick woke before dawn on Friday morning to find the apartment unusually quiet. Even in her most careful moments, Sarah's morning preparations created subtle sounds that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The soft scrape of the coffee pot against the stove, the gentle rustle of her skirts as she moved through the kitchen, the quiet opening and closing of cupboard doors as she prepared breakfast. This morning, the silence felt wrong, charged with an absence that made his skin prickle with unease. He rose quickly, pulling on his work clothes without his usual morning routine of washing at the basin. The kitchen was empty, but not in the way it had been before Sarah's arrival. This emptiness felt deliberate, as if someone had carefully removed all traces of their presence. The coffee pot sat cold on the stove, and Sarah's few personal belongings, the small mirror she used for pinning her hair, the worn prayer book she read by candlelight in the evenings, the extra apron she kept folded on a shelf were gone. On the kitchen table, weighted down by the salt shaker to prevent it from blowing away in the draft that came through the window, was a single piece of paper covered in Sarah's careful handwriting. Patrick's hands shook as he picked it up, already knowing what it would contain but hoping desperately that he was wrong. "Mr. O'Shea," the note began, using the formal address she had maintained even after weeks of shared domestic intimacy. "I should not have stayed as long as I did. Your children deserve better than the dangers I bring with me, and you deserve the truth I have been too afraid to share. I am not the woman you believed you were helping. I am someone who brings trouble to good people, and I cannot bear the thought of that trouble touching Molly and Timothy." Patrick sank into his chair, the paper trembling in his grip as he continued reading. Sarah's words were carefully chosen, each sentence constructed to minimize the pain of her departure while making it clear that she had no intention of returning. "Please tell the children that I left because I had to, not because they did anything wrong. Tell Timothy that his carved figures are the most beautiful things I have ever seen, and that any mother would be proud to have such a thoughtful son. Tell Molly that she has the strength to be anything she chooses to be, and that she should never let anyone convince her otherwise. They are extraordinary children, and they will grow into extraordinary adults under your loving care." The note went on to provide practical information about the household, where she had hidden the extra flour she had purchased, which of Timothy's clothes needed mending, when Molly's shoes would need to be replaced. Even in departure, Sarah was thinking of their needs, trying to smooth the transition back to life without her presence. "I have taken only what I brought with me. The money you left for household expenses is in the coffee tin, along with what I earned from the extra sewing I did for Mrs. Chin downstairs. I hope it will be enough to help you find someone more suitable to care for your family. Someone who can love your children without reservation. Someone who doesn't have to look over her shoulder every time she ventures into the street." Patrick finished reading and immediately began searching for clues about where Sarah might have gone. Her suitcase was missing from the alcove where she slept, and the few dresses she owned were no longer hanging from the nails she had driven into the wall. She had been thorough in removing her presence, but she had also been hasty. A faint scent of her soap still lingered in the air, and the blanket she used was still slightly warm to the touch. Without stopping to consider the wisdom of his actions, Patrick grabbed his coat and hat and rushed from the apartment. He left a hastily scrawled note for the children, knowing they would wake soon and find Sarah gone, but unable to face their questions and confusion until he had at least tried to find her. The morning air was sharp with the promise of winter, and the streets were beginning to fill with workers heading to the docks, the factories, the countless jobs that kept the city functioning. Patrick had no clear plan, only an instinctive understanding that Sarah would seek familiar territory when she felt threatened. The women's shelter was the obvious place to start, but something told him she wouldn't return to Sister Rebecca immediately. Sarah was too careful, too aware of the dangers that followed her to put other vulnerable women at risk by leading trouble to their door. He found her at Tompkins Square Park, sitting on a bench near the fountain with her suitcase beside her, and her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white through her gloves. She wasn't looking around nervously or watching for pursuers. Instead, she sat with the stillness of someone who had made a decision and was gathering strength to carry it through. Her profile was sharp against the gray morning sky, and Patrick could see that she had been crying. Patrick approached carefully, not wanting to startle her or give her reason to bolt before he could speak. When he was close enough to see the tear tracks on her cheeks, he cleared his throat softly to announce his presence. Sarah looked up at him with an expression that mixed relief with resignation, as if she had been expecting him but had hoped he wouldn't come. "I found your note," Patrick said, settling beside her on the bench without waiting for permission. "The children don't know yet that you're gone." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper when she replied, "It's better this way. They'll adjust more easily if I disappear now, before they become too attached." "Too attached?" Patrick turned to face her fully, incredulous. "Sarah, Timothy called you Mama. Molly smiles more in one day now than she did in months before you came. They're already attached. That's exactly why I have to leave." Sarah's hands twisted in her lap, and Patrick noticed that she was holding something, a small wooden figure that he recognized as one of Timothy's carvings. "I read my letter, didn't I?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Patrick could have lied, could have pretended ignorance and forced Sarah to explain her circumstances herself. Instead, he chose honesty. "I was looking for thread," he said. "I saw my name and Yes, I read it." Sarah nodded, accepting this admission without anger or accusation. "Then you know what kind of woman you invited into your home. You know what could happen to your children if the wrong people come looking for me. I know that you're a mother who had her child stolen from her by a man with connections and a flexible relationship with the truth," Patrick said firmly. "I know that you've been running from people who would rather silence you than let you fight for your daughter. And I know that my children need you as much as you need them, even if that scares both of us." Sarah turned Timothy's carved figure over in her hands, studying its rough but recognizable features. "He made this one of me," she said softly. "Look at the face. He somehow caught the way I look when I'm watching him play. No one has ever seen me that clearly before, Patrick. No one has ever cared enough to notice how I hold my mouth when I'm trying not to smile, or the way I tilt my head when I'm listening to something important." "Then don't take that away from him," Patrick said. "Don't take it away from any of us." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the fountain where early morning light created small rainbows in the spray. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision that could change all their lives. "I didn't mean to start loving them." "Neither did I," Patrick replied. "But here we are." Part 6. Acceptance and New Roots, 3,500 characters. The walk back to the tenement building passed in contemplative silence, but it was different from the careful quiet that had characterized their early days together. This silence felt like a conversation conducted in a language deeper than words, an acknowledgement of truths that had been spoken and accepted. Sarah carried her suitcase in one hand and Timothy's carved figure in the other, while Patrick walked close enough beside her that their shoulders occasionally brushed as they navigated the crowded sidewalks. When they climbed the familiar stairs to the third floor, they could hear voices from within the apartment, Molly's patient tones mixing with Timothy's higher, more agitated responses. Patrick paused with his hand on the door handle, looking at Sarah with a question in his eyes. She straightened her shoulders and nodded once, a gesture that spoke of resolution rather than resignation. The kitchen door opened to reveal a scene that might have been comic under different circumstances. Molly stood at the stove, attempting to manage breakfast preparations while Timothy sat at the table with tears streaming down his face, clutching one of his wooden figures against his chest. Both children looked up as their guardians entered, their expressions shifting rapidly from confusion to relief to something approaching joy. "Sarah!" Timothy launched himself from his chair with such force that he nearly knocked over the milk pitcher, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing his face against her skirt. "I thought you were gone forever. I thought I made you sad when I called you. When I said—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. Sarah set down her suitcase and knelt to Timothy's level, her hands framing his tear-stained face with infinite gentleness. "You didn't make me sad, sweetheart. You reminded me of something beautiful I thought I had lost." Sometimes adults get scared when they feel too much happiness, because they're afraid it might be taken away from them. Molly approached more cautiously, her 12-year-old wisdom making her sensitive to the undercurrents of adult emotion that Timothy couldn't yet fully comprehend. "Are you staying?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral but her eyes bright with hope. "If you'll have me," Sarah replied, rising from her crouch but keeping one hand on Timothy's shoulder. "If your father agrees, and if you both understand that my staying might mean difficult times ahead. There are people who might come looking for me, people who might ask questions or cause trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Molly asked, displaying the directness that had helped her survive the responsibilities thrust upon her after her mother's death. Patrick stepped forward, recognizing that this moment required honesty rather than protection through ignorance. "Sarah had a little girl who was taken from her by bad men who lied to the law. She's been hiding from them, trying to stay safe until she can find a way to get her daughter back. If they find her here, they might try to hurt all of us to keep their lies from being discovered." Timothy looked up at Sarah with wide eyes. "You have a little girl? Like Molly?" "Younger than Molly," Sarah said softly. "About your age. Her name is Hazel, and she has dark hair like mine and eyes that change color in different light, just like yours do." "Where is she now?" Molly asked. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, and the pain in her voice was so raw that both children instinctively moved closer to her. "But I'm going to find her someday, and when I do, I hope you'll help me welcome her into our family." The word family hung in the air like a promise, transforming their small kitchen into something that felt larger and more permanent than any of them had dared to imagine. Timothy reached into his pocket and pulled out another of his carved figures, this one clearly meant to represent a small girl with long hair. "I made this one for when she comes home," he said, placing the figure in Sarah's palm. "So she'll know she belongs here too." Sarah's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her cheeks as she pulled both children into her embrace. Patrick watched this scene unfold with his own eyes burning, understanding that they had just crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. They were no longer simply individuals sharing living space out of necessity. They had become a family bound together by choice, love, and shared determination to protect what they had built. Over the following days, the atmosphere in their home transformed completely. Sarah no longer maintained careful emotional distance, allowing herself to respond naturally to the children's need for maternal affection. She taught Molly more advanced sewing techniques, including how to embroider flowers and birds that could make even the plainest dress beautiful. She helped Timothy develop his carving skills, showing him how to use different techniques to create texture in wood and how to plan more complex figures before beginning to cut. Patrick found himself watching these interactions with wonder, seeing how Sarah's presence had awakened aspects of his children's personalities that had been dormant since Mary's death. Molly had begun humming while she worked, her natural cheerfulness reasserting itself now that she no longer carried the full weight of household management. Timothy talked more freely, sharing his thoughts and dreams with the confidence of a child who knew his words would be received with interest and respect. The evenings became especially precious. After dinner, they would gather around the table while Sarah mended clothes or Patrick worked on small repairs, and the children would take turns reading aloud from books borrowed from the settlement house library. Timothy's reading was improving rapidly under Sarah's patient guidance, and Molly had discovered a love for poetry that made her voice take on new rhythms and cadences as she practiced different verses. Sarah began sharing stories of her own childhood, carefully edited tales of growing up in rural Pennsylvania that gave the children glimpses of different ways of living while avoiding the darker aspects of her recent experiences. She taught them songs her own mother had sung, simple melodies that filled their small apartment with music that spoke of continuity and tradition. Patrick noticed that Sarah slept better now, no longer starting awake at every small sound from the street below. She had begun contributing her own touches to their domestic arrangements, wildflowers picked from vacant lots and arranged in makeshift vases, extra attention to meals that made even simple ingredients taste special, small improvements to their living space that made it feel more like a home and less like a place where people merely survived. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had stopped looking toward the door every time footsteps passed in the hallway outside their apartment. She moved through their daily routines with the presence of someone who expected to be there tomorrow, and the day after, and for as long as the family needed her. The constant wariness hadn't disappeared entirely. Patrick sometimes caught her scanning crowds when they ventured out together, and she still kept her few possessions organized in a way that would allow for quick departure if necessary. But these precautions no longer dominated her every waking moment. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Molly approached Sarah with a length of ribbon she had been saving from her mother's sewing supplies. "Mama always said this was too pretty to use for anything ordinary," she said, holding out the pale blue silk. "But I think your hair is special enough for it." Sarah accepted the ribbon with trembling hands, understanding the significance of the gift. By offering something that had belonged to Mary, Molly was officially welcoming Sarah into the family legacy, acknowledging her not as a replacement for the mother they had lost, but as someone worthy of holding her own place in their hearts. That night, Patrick lay in his narrow bed listening to the sounds of his transformed household settling into sleep. Sarah's quiet breathing from her alcove, Timothy's occasional sleep murmurs from the corner where his small bed nestled against the wall, Molly's barely audible sighs from the pallet they had arranged near the window. For the first time since Mary's death, Patrick felt something approaching contentment, a sense that they had created something worth protecting regardless of what challenges might lie ahead.